Hello, good evening,
I'm
Mirabai. How are
feeling
you, honey?
I'm feeling great. How are you,
I'm
Carolyn?
I'm good. I'm good. I think the title of this evening's class is so delicious. Angels Rush In. Isn't that lovely? And of
Mhm.
course, I know it's true. I know it's absolutely the truth. We've both had experiences with angelic companions numerous times, but it's wonderful to talk about. And I know I've never met a person who said, I have no interest in angels.
Yeah.
I've never met anybody who would turn down a conversation about, was are angels near me, or how do I get in contact with an angel or whatever. But it's just a wonderful topic. So take it away.
Thank you, Carolyn. With pleasure. Hello, friends. It's good to be with you again. So, I'd like to begin by lighting a candle and calling in those angels and the ancestors and what other invisible beings are available to us that we often are not aware of. So, with this candle, I welcome and invite you to welcome the unseen beings who are here to support us and who especially come flowing into broken open spaces, to the space of the broken open heart. When we are shattered, the great mystical paradox is that those broken seams, those torn seams, are places where the sacred can flow in. Am I suggesting that it's okay that we experience these great losses? No, nothing will ever be worth it in a way. And yet, there is this privileged access, it seems, to the realms of the sacred, not despite, but through that fiery gate of loss. So, welcome to all of you, whatever your story is that led you to gather here today. I bow to your experience of transformational loss and invite you to tune into the presence of those angelic beings who support us when we are most in need. I'd like to read a poem, as I always do at the beginning of a session, that I feel reflects something beautiful about this station on the grief journey, this initial place of being shattered by loss and brought into contact with something that we may not have expected, that changes the quality of what we're going through. This is a poem called Who Understands Me But Me? And this is by a guy named Jimmy Santiago Baca. Jimmy Santiago Baca is a Chicano poet and activist. He's an activist in the prison reform movement. And he lives here in my home state of New Mexico. And Jimmy went to prison when he was 18 for being an accomplice in an armed robbery in Albuquerque. And when he was in prison, he acted out, and it just kept getting worse and worse for him. He spent a lot of time in solitary confinement. His sentence got longer and longer. It was a desperate and terrifying situation. You know, he was a teenager. At 18, you're still a kid, and he just kept making bad choices. So when he went to prison, he was illiterate. He had not yet learned to read, and he taught himself to read in prison. And then he began to write poetry to kind of survive, just to maintain his sanity somehow, distilling his experience into the sparse lines of a poem. And probably also because it was easier to write poetry than prose because he didn't have to write complete sentences and no grammar. But he became a finer and finer poet, and his poetry began giving back to him, truly saving him. I think about John of the Cross, San Juan de la Cruz, the 16th century Spanish mystic who I had the great privilege of translating into, I hope, accessible and beautiful English many years ago. And John of the Cross also was incarcerated for 9 months, actually in for helping Teresa de Avila, Santa Teresa de Avila, Saint Teresa, in her reform movement. So he was persecuted for his support of Teresa's reform movement, which was quite radical. And while he was in prison, he also wrote poetry, except he didn't have anything to write on. So he would write it in his mind and then commit it to memory. And when he finally miraculously escaped from prison after 9 months, half dead, he was able to write down the poems that he composed while incarcerated. And this is part of the canon of Spanish poetry, and it's why he's the patron saint of poetry. These exquisite love poems to God that he wrote in the darkest of his darkest times. So I think for me too, and maybe for some of you, the written word has been a lifeline when we have suffered, at least when you were a teenager maybe, and you wrote in your journal to save your life. So this poem is called Who Understands Me But Me by Jimmy Santiago Baca. They turn the water off, so I live without water. They build walls higher, so I live without treetops. They paint the windows black, so I live without sunshine. They lock my cage, so I live without going anywhere. They take each last tear I have. I live without tears. They take my heart and rip it open. I live without heart. They take my life and crush it, so I live without a future. They say I am beastly and fiendish, so I have no friends. They stop up each hope, so I have no passage out of hell. They give me pain, so I live with pain. They give me hate, so I live with my hate. They have changed me, and I am not the same man. They give me no shower, so I live with my smell. They separate me from my brothers, so I live without brothers. Who understands me when I say, this is beautiful? Who understands me when I say, I have found other freedoms? I cannot fly or make something appear in my hand. I cannot make the heavens open or the earth tremble. I can live with myself, and I am amazed at myself, my love, my beauty. I am taken by my failures, astounded by my fears. I am stubborn and childish. In the midst of this wreckage of life they incurred, I practice being myself. And I have found parts of myself never dreamed of by me. They were goaded out from under rocks in my heart when the walls were built higher, when the water was turned off and the windows painted black. I followed these signs like an old tracker and followed the tracks deep into myself, followed the blood-spotted path deeper into dangerous regions, and found so many parts of myself who taught me water is not everything and gave me new eyes to see through walls. And when they spoke, sunlight came out of their mouths, and I was laughing at me with them. We laughed like children and made pacts always to be loyal. Who understands me when I say, this is beautiful? So Jimmy and John of the Cross are not the only ones to have had this experience where shattering loss, where unbearable anguish knocks on the door of the heart, of the soul, and it opens amazingly, miraculously. And when it does, there is this sense of the inflowing of this angelic support. You don't have to believe in angels as entities in order to resonate, I think, with this sense of proximity to the sacred, and also the presence of a loving being or beings who enfold and protect and lift you and keep you safe when you most feel vulnerable, when you feel most vulnerable. So, where Kubler-Ross spoke about that initial shattering station of the grief journey as provoking some kind of state of denial, which has a negative connotation, like you're refusing to believe that what happened, or you're kind of disconnected or dissociated from the reality. I'd like to invoke the sense of grace that accompanies the early stages of loss, and also when loss is re-triggered. It could be an old loss that flares up, those griefs that are connected to things that happened long ago, but sometimes when they're triggered, we're fully in it, fully grieving. So that is a sacred space, according to the mystics that I know of every tradition. That broken space, whether it's from something that happened yesterday afternoon or 25 years ago, when we're feeling that shattering is when we are being invited into that presence. So regardless of your belief system, see if you can lean in to a memory of or a felt sense in this moment of that presence, that sacred presence, what I call the fragrance of the sacred wafting up from the fire of loss, that grace. And we are often catapulted into a dreamlike state in the wake of a great loss. It's that sense of being somehow insulated from the intensity of what has happened. And that is a beautiful blend of biochemistry and something on a soul level that are not mutually exclusive. It's not one or the other. It's not either a matter of some kind of neurochemicals that we're being flooded with, that are protecting us from going crazy with the impact of what we're grieving, of what we have lost. That is happening. That has been measured scientifically. And simultaneously, I believe, braided in with that physiological reality is this grace of feeling held and protected, yes, but also there is this liminal space that we enter. That dreamlike realm is real. It's real. So yes, there is often anguish in it. Like, I feel like this is a terrible dream and I'm going to go to sleep and wake up and it won't be true that my loved one died in a car accident or that my boyfriend is sleeping with someone else. It's a bad dream. So that feeling of being a sleepwalker in your life isn't always a good feeling. Nor am I suggesting that this is always good news. It's like you're on autopilot, but you're just the walking dead sometimes when you've experienced a great loss. But if we keep walking, really, actually, if we show up, completely for this experience, this fugue-like state, this fugue state, this liminal space, this dreamlike moment. If we can breathe into it, be present for it, it will begin to open its secrets. So it's as if, maybe not as if, I believe what is actually happening is that when the fire of loss comes raging through the landscape of our lives and takes it to the ground, we are granted access to something that we don't have access to most of the rest of the time. We can get there through spiritual practices, but I'm telling you, and I think you know, years on a meditation cushion may not yield what even a moment in this shattered state can, if we allow ourselves with great tenderness and self-compassion to show up for it. That's when it's like the veils that ordinarily obscure that supernatural, sacred, what Carolyn would call heavenly realm drop. And I'm telling you, this is temporary, because all too soon, the veils that have fallen come back, and we are brought back in to a more quotidian, ordinary, everyday, mundane reality with our broken hearts. We limp back into the world, to the regular world. And so when you have access through this, the power of loss, to these sacred spaces, take them, take it, say yes. I know it's hard. I know it's excruciating. It's basically saying, yes, I will abide in a space of unbearable anguish. I will sit in the fire. I will allow the tidal wave of loss to wash over me until I'm drowning. Yes. Because there's this feeling, if you tune into it, of something holy is happening right now, and I don't want to miss it. I don't want to squander this moment. I think there is a wisdom that is available to us that will whisper that in our ears if we dare to listen. Stay here. This, as long as you can, it won't last. But while it does, be here. Be present. Sometimes this experience of grace, this liminal space, this angelic zone that we're in, can feel like numbness. Like we think we should be sad and we're not feeling the sadness. I mean, it's out there. It's right behind this other thing, waiting for us. And we're sad also. It's like, here's the thing. The shattered heart is boundless in its capacity, and it is capable of holding seemingly contradictory states. I am sad and I am bathed in grace. My loved one is dead and my loved one is present with me right now. I have a friend who's actually a nail tech, a Vietnamese nail technician, and her mother just died in Vietnam a couple of weeks ago. Actually, it was almost a month ago now, because the Vietnamese, like Tibetan Buddhists, believe that the soul goes through 49 days in the bardos, as in Tibetan Buddhism with the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and that their souls are going through this series of gates, and they have to go accomplish sort of certain things that they have to take care of before they can either enter into the next life or whatever the heavenly abode might be that's waiting for them. And the job of the loved ones is to keep praying for that person as they're chanting, doing rituals as they're going through this process. And so Michelle told me that yesterday was the 49 days, and I offered to light a candle and asked what the chant would be. And I said, have you been feeling her presence during this period? And she said, no, I can't, because I'm here in America and her soul is in Vietnam and it's too far to visit me. And I was so struck by that. It was such a clear belief in the presence of the soul realm and how it works, how it operates. And I'd like to suggest that is one way to look at it, that there is some geography, some physical geography that plays into this, but it also transcends everything that we think. And it transcends time, not only space, but time. And that our loved ones are available to us in ways we cannot even imagine. And the angels who love us unconditionally are available to us. And when we utter our sometimes quiet and reluctant, yes, please hold me right now. Even if you have to use what my friend Ramdas called your holy imagination. You have the faculty of imagination. Whether these things are objectively true or not, you are capable of using your imagination to enter in to these sacred spaces. So that feeling of numbness doesn't have to be a problem. It can be an access point to that metaphysical realm. So there's nothing wrong with you, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You're not doing it wrong, you're grieving. And that feeling of insulation is part of the gift of being able to survive what's happening and tune in. So tune in. I'll share with you several experiences I had when my daughter died in a car accident when she was 14. And I was completely unprepared for that experience. So it was a shattering loss. And I know there are some of you listening right now that are part of that club of parents who have lost children and know what that particular shattering grief is. The first one was, so she disappeared one night. She took my car. She stole my car. She was 14 and took off. And she was gone all night. And she died that night, but I didn't know it yet. I didn't know it till the next day when her body was found. The crash was discovered. But all night long, I didn't know what was happening. So I went in and out of a fitful sleep, on the couch, waiting for her to come home. And there was this one moment when I fell asleep and I woke up with a start. And I had this feeling of inexplicable peace wash over me. And this voice inside me, my voice, it felt like said, if Jenny dies tonight, it will be okay. I was desperately afraid that whatever was happening, she wasn't going to make it. And she didn't. But I didn't know that yet. But this deep calm, this inexplicable peace came over me and planted that message in my heart so that when I needed it, I could find it. I actually forgot all about it that next day when I had to go to the funeral home and identify her body and the police and all the things, all the tumult and chaos and horror of those next few days. And then maybe a week later, it was over a month later. I was doing a ritual year of mourning in the Jewish tradition, which is my ancestral tradition. I hadn't learned a thing about it from my parents because they were completely anti-religious. So I had to learn it from friends and books. And so I decided to do a year-long cycle of mourning that has various ways to support a grieving person. I won't go into it now. But one of the things is you don't go to parties, you don't go to movies, you don't go to restaurants, you don't do any of those social things. You really focus on being present with your broken heart. But I did go to a movie with my husband. Bad idea. I felt like I had no skin on me, being out in public. And we watched a movie. I don't even remember what it was now, but in the movie, the main character, who's a teenager, sits up in bed because he feels the presence of someone in his room. And he looks to the foot of his bed, and it's his grandfather, who he loves very much. And the grandfather has come to say goodbye to him. He didn't know that the grandfather had died or was dying in that moment. But the grandfather came to say he was leaving and he loved him and, give him messages of love and support. And when we left the theater, we were in the car. I remember it very vividly. I remember slamming the door. I mean, we were driving already with my fist. My husband was driving and saying, how come everybody else gets visitations from their loved ones? Why don't I? And I started wailing. And then when I quieted, I remembered the dream that night when Jenny died, before I knew she had died. It was probably right around then. It was around midnight when she died, when she crashed, according to the coroner. And that seems like maybe when I fell asleep. So that was one. Another one was when just a few days in, this was the one that was just a few days in, everyone, my family and friends, were around me all the time. They were trying to help me and support me in my grief. From the moment Jenny died onward, it's like nobody wanted to leave me. And I wanted to be alone. Like I desperately needed to just be with myself and turn inward like a hedgehog or a turtle or something into my shell and just kind of be with it for a minute. I felt distracted by all the loving support. And finally, I convinced them all to just leave me alone for an hour. And then I could get on with it, right? So I was on the floor and I was crying. I didn't cry all the time, but I allowed myself to just, because it felt like crying was going to kill me, frankly. But in that moment, I knew I needed to just let myself be broken open. So I was crying on the floor. And I stopped when I felt finished, because I think something was kind of playing at the edges of my awareness. I stopped crying and I kind of leaned in to pay attention to what it was. And I'm not someone who has a lot of supernatural experiences, by the way. I should tell you that. Visions and voices and things. It's pretty rare for me. I'm a pretty grounded, practical person. But in that moment, I felt this murmuring, or heard this murmuring, and it was women's voices. It was the voices of women. And I realized they were mothers. And then I realized they were mothers like me who had lost children. And they were speaking to each other, and they were speaking to me, and they were soothing me, and they were enfolding me in this like network. It was like this network of wing to wing, or like a web or a net. It felt like a net, actually, that was holding me and keeping me from drowning. So this net of mothers, I called it, that was made up of all the women backwards in time and also forwards in time and also right now. Jenny died right after 9/11, and the US had just attacked Afghanistan. And I knew intellectually with my rational mind that women in the Middle East right now, actually in Afghanistan in particular right now, were experiencing the deaths of their children. So I felt the sense of belonging. It was a terrible belonging, but it was a homecoming nevertheless. And I got the next part of the message was, right now, Mirabai, all you have to do is let yourself down into the arms of these other mothers, and your time will come. Your turn to do the holding. Right now, you just need to let yourself be held. And that is absolutely what happened and what is happening. Now it's my turn to be there for other mothers and other people who have experienced shattering loss, and having been resourced by the invisible ones the angelic ones, that presence that I cannot necessarily identify and categorize, but that I know intimately through experience, and that I think you do too. You know, if you tune into your most profound losses, right in the midst of that fire is that perfume of holy presence, of love that is available to you. So, let's see. Okay. So, you can identify that presence, again, using your imagination or connecting with your own spiritual beliefs and belief systems. You might want to name that presence as angels, archangels. You may choose or actually feel the presence of a particular entity, like Mother Mary. As a Jewish woman, I identify deeply with Mary. She was a Jewish mother who lost a child also. I remember after Jenny died, I told you 3 things. Okay. Maybe a little less than a year later, it was right before the end of the ritual mourning period, I was in New York to meet with my editor. I was translating Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle during that first year of mourning. That was one of the things that saved me, like John of the Cross in prison writing poetry, or Jimmy Santiago Baca teaching himself to read and write. So I was translating the Interior Castle for that first year, which made it much easier to remove myself from the world. I was very lucky that way. And so I went to New York to meet with my editor to do the final things. In those days, people were still meeting in person with editors. Everything's online now. And my sister and brother went with me to keep me company and just sort of accompany me traveling because I was still feeling pretty shaky. And we went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and we went into that room that has all of the Marys, a lot of versions of the Pietà, of Mary holding Jesus's body when he's been taken down from the cross. And all of the different versions of Mary and Jesus, but especially Mary at the foot of the cross while he's hanging there, and Mary holding his body, felt personal to me and somehow soothed my heart. I just felt like she was my Mary and that she had me. Like, I've got you, Mirabai. I've got you. And so Mother Mary became this incredible ally for me on my grief journey. You may find that Tara in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the Bodhisattva of compassion, is an ally for you. Tara came into being. She was formed from a tear that the Buddha wept when he looked upon the suffering of the world, and it broke his heart. And his falling tear, became Tara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. Maybe Kuan Yin, who's kind of the Mary of the Chinese Buddhist tradition. She is the mother of mercy. She who hears the cries of the world. It's one of the names of Kuan Yin. It certainly applies to Mother Mary. She who hears the cries of the world, the mother of the world. Maybe she's not a motherly presence, this angelic presence that you can reach for, but still is feminine. Maybe it's the Shekhinah. In the Jewish tradition, the Shekhinah is simply the indwelling feminine presence of the divine. There's the transcendent divine, beyond all description, beyond all form. And then there's the indwelling feminine presence that is embodied, the Shekhinah. Maybe it's Sophia in the Christian mystical tradition, the embodiment of wisdom. Maybe it's Jesus or any of the saints of the Christian tradition, the Hindu pantheon. There are many beings who do not have bodies or personal histories, I mean, Mary and Jesus did have do have personal histories, but maybe it's some supernatural entity that becomes your touchstone when you can't bear the unbearable. That is your access to the sacred, to the essence of unconditional love and holding and protection. So I was going to tell you about my father. So when my father died, I had one of those experiences. So he had cancer and he was dying, but he wasn't yet in the active dying phase, we thought. So he was here in Taos, our whole family. I've 4 generations here. And I had gone to Albuquerque, which is about 3 hours away, with my boyfriend at the time to drop his daughter at the airport, who had spent the summer with us. And on the way home, we stopped at the house of a dear friend of mine. She was my graduate advisor from grad school, great renowned sort of philosophy professor and dear friend, godmother of my children, Charlene. And we were going to have brunch with her after dropping Leila at the airport on our way home to Taos. And so we walked in the door, and we didn't have cell phones then. It was kind of right before the cell phone era. And Charlene had gotten a call from my mother because my mom knew that I was going to be there. And we walked in the door, and Charlene looked kind of stricken. So I knew something was up. And she said, "I need to speak with you." And she took me back into her office in her home and told me that I should call my mom. And I knew intuitively. I said, "Is it my father?" And she said, "Yes." So she gave me a cup of tea and closed the door, and I called my mom, and she told me, yes, my father had died, and they were keeping his body there in the house for me to come and say goodbye. So when they would wait until I got home 3 hours later. And so I thanked my mom, hung up, and before going back into the house to mingle with the other people who I knew would be loving and compassionate, nevertheless, I needed a minute. I sat in Charlene's chair in her office, and I remember wrapping my arms around my own shoulders. And suddenly, I can feel it right now, try it. I felt like my father was holding me. I mean, I truly experienced my dad holding me. What's interesting is he wasn't much of a cuddler. He wasn't a cuddly guy. He didn't hug or kiss much, rarely said, "I love you." But in that moment, it was this warm embrace of father love. And it was as real as my speaking to you. And I just bathed in that for a few minutes before I went in to the house, ate a little, and got on the road to deal with what was next. And that feeling of his presence stayed with me. So maybe your losses have happened a long time ago, and you think that it's too late because the spirits are gone. And it's not only the death. Remember, Carolyn and I both spoke about that last week. It's not only the death of loved ones that we grieve. There are so many losses that break us open, for which we need and to which we have access this unspeakable angelic support. There are many times when we experience loss. It doesn't have to be catastrophic loss. When we experience something that causes us to grieve, when we have this impulse to turn inward, and other people's opinions may be, and often are, that we shouldn't be alone. Like my family when Jenny died. Like we have to swoop in and take care of everything. And it is very wonderful when people can take care of the practical things, because we can become very disconnected and dissociated, and it's hard to do ordinary things like feed yourself. That's the first to go for me. my ability to eat, be partly because, as it says on Yom Kippur, in the Jewish tradition, when we're fasting, the Day of Atonement, you fast and pray all day. And that's so that you can be like the angels who don't need food. So great loss can kind of catapult us, as I said, into that angelic realm. So it's hard to take care of your basic needs. It's nice to have people do those things for you. The Jewish tradition is really good with those customs, that when someone you love dies, someone who's very close to you, a parent, a sibling, or a child, especially, or spouse, you sit Shiva for 7 days. Sitting Shiva, Shiva, is a tradition, a custom where you, for the first 7 days following the funeral, and you bury, in Judaism and Islam, you bury your loved one within 24 hours. So after the funeral, for 7 days, people come to your home every day and bring food. The close community bring you food and pray with you. And they pray the Kaddish, which is the traditional mourner's prayer. Interestingly, the mourner's prayer doesn't say anything about death or about grief. It is all about exalting the divine and praying for peace for the whole world. That's what you do in the Kaddish. And so people come and bring you food, and at sunset chant the Kaddish with you, and then leave for 7 days, and then once a month throughout that first year. So the thing that I was finding was this need to be alone. Yes, I needed people to come once a day and bring food. That was great. My husband needed it too, because he was tending me. But I also needed the rest of and I needed them to pray with me. But the rest of the time, I really needed solitude. Not every minute of every day, but for a few hours a day. I needed that Sabbath of the soul when there was nothing to be done, but I could just be. And you may find, and maybe some of you have grappled with this, that the people who care about you are going to think you're isolating. They're going to worry that you're cutting yourself off and that it's unhealthy. Maybe you're not bathing as much as they think you should, or eating as well as you should. I guess I'm inviting you to trust your own impulse to withdraw into the refuge of solitude. There is wisdom in it. Yes, it can become unhealthy, especially if you mix in substance use that can lead to substance abuse. That is something that people can do. They can isolate and do substances that do them harm. I'm not speaking from some high horse here, but I will say that when I have had great losses, the last thing I want to do is get stoned or drunk because of this very experience of the presence of the sacred. I don't want to miss it. I mean, I hope that doesn't sound masochistic. It isn't. It's a soul wisdom that has spoken to me that says, stay here, be clear, and be present. And I don't do it as an act of spiritual calisthenics. Like, look at me, I've built up these soul muscles and I can bear the unbearable. I can meditate my way into a state of grace. No, it's an act of love. It's like, I'm going to stay here as my love offering, either to my loved one who died or to my own dear self who is grieving. I'm not going to check out. So in this state, this sacred state of initial loss or re-experiencing an older loss, when the angels come rushing in, we are invited to make of our attention an offering of love, a dedication, either to yourself, to a loved one who has died, or to God, of your fiery, broken open, melted down pulp of a heart. It's like the caterpillar in the chrysalis. We dissolve. And we can't know that something holy is happening, but we can feel it if we stop being so busy trying to fix it. As I said, it's going to pass, this fugue state, this liminal space, this dreamlike quality. And the veil that's been melted away, that enables us to see and access this angelic sphere, even if we can't like pinpoint that that's what it is, will come back. I'm just reminding you. You probably know from experience. It's, I became a grief counselor after my daughter died. I went through a grief group. I didn't do it right away. Like I couldn't go to a grief group for a couple of months at least, I think. And then time's funny. It's like, catastrophic loss can be like brain damage. In fact, I think that there is some research has been done that grief can mimic a head injury. And so there's amnesia, there are things that happen in the early stages that are quite similar to a head injury. But anyway, so I don't quite remember the time frame, but at one point I did finally do a grief group, and it was being led by a dear friend of mine who had been a teacher also in the school where I had been a young teacher in our late 20s and early 30s, who had lost two children in a car, both of his kids, in a car accident 2 years after his beloved wife, who had been his high school sweetheart, had died of a brain tumor. 2 years later, both their children were killed in a car accident. So talk about shattering loss. So Ted had gone off and kind of disappeared from Taos for a couple of years and came back as a grief counselor and created a grief sanctuary called Golden Willow. It still exists. Check it out, Golden Willow. And he wanted to create a place for people experiencing great loss to come and have refuge, have sanctuary, because it's hard to find. So Ted was leading a grief group. I was attending, and I went through several cycles, and he said, I think you should be doing this work. And he arranged for me to have a scholarship at a graduate program in grief counseling, which I then did. I lasted about 11 minutes as a grief counselor. Slight exaggeration, but the point is, one-on-one counseling was not my dharma, was not my way. But working with groups turned out to be my way. But what I noticed when I was working with grieving people was that unanimously there was like this, as if they were telling a dirty secret, they would express that in the depths of their anguish was when they felt closest to God. And moreover, that they secretly yearned for the early days of their loss. That terrible beginning when you couldn't stand what happened, because it was accompanied by this braided experience of the divine presence. And it was something they would confess as if it was illicit. My friends, if you have experienced the presence of the sacred in the midst of your deepest, most profound losses, there is nothing wrong with you. There is everything right. This is the great gift that we are given. And that yearning that once that state passes, that we secretly harbor for a return to that place is entwined with our soul's birthright of longing for God. In my opinion, these things are connected. The power and depth and beauty of our love longing for someone we love who's died, or someone who's left us, or a life that we've left behind, or the capacities of our bodies in the wake of a serious health diagnosis. The yearning that accompanies those losses is, if not the same as, completely connected to our soul's desire for union with the divine. And so, by tuning into it, by saying, yes, I will feel these feelings, even if it feels like it's going to kill me. Mostly it won't. I have seen a few people die of broken hearts, I will say. But mostly it will not kill us. But what it will do is kill those parts of us that were obstacles to intimacy with the divine, if we let it. There's no accident that every spiritual tradition that I know of, at least, let's say at least the monotheistic traditions, but no, it's in Hinduism and Buddhism too, probably in Taoism, assert this teaching of dying before you die. Die before you die. And I know it's in the esoteric Western tradition. Die before you die so that when you die, you won't die. I mean, that's the Eucharist. It's at the heart of the Christian tradition. It's the great gift, in a way, of the incarnational theology. So when we experience a great loss, we die. Something in us dies. And that death, dare I say, can be a cause for celebration, because it allows us to be that much more naked, stripped, and available for union. What else do I want to share with you? How about Julian of Norwich? For a moment, I want to tell you about Julian. So Julian of Norwich was the great medieval English mystic and visionary who lived during the time of the plague. In fact, Julian lived through, I think, 3 rounds of the plague in her lifetime. Matthew Fox says it was more than 3 rounds. Matthew Fox, as you may know, has written beautifully about Julian of Norwich. And so during the plague in Europe in the 14th century, which was Julian's time, she lived in England. It's estimated that between 30 and 50% of the population was eradicated by the plague. So roughly half the people died of the plague. And if you were infected, you died, 100%. And so imagine living in that terror. We went through the COVID lockdown that was very scary, especially in the early days when people were dying. A lot of people were dying, more than we may have realized. And we were asked to shelter in place. So in Julian's time, people were also trying to find ways to protect themselves from this horrific virus, this bubonic plague. And loved ones were dying all the time. Loved ones were constantly dying. So there was tremendous grief and loss happening throughout Europe. So Julian must have experienced the death of close to half of the people she loved, which means it's very likely that she lost her spouse and possibly at least one child, if not more. So Julian was the first woman to write in English, and her book, she lived during the time of Chaucer. They were contemporaries, Chaucer and Julian of Norwich. Julian wasn't even really her name, but that's another story. So she wrote a book called Revelations of Divine Love, or The Showings of Julian of Norwich, which I also had the great privilege of translating from Middle English to contemporary English. And at the beginning of the showings, she says that she was 30 years old and she had no reason to live. And an illness overtook her and brought her to the brink of death. It wasn't the plague, because she did survive, but I think it was heartbreak, because I have seen mothers die or almost die of broken heart. Fathers do. People. So she was brought to the brink of death, and she was given a vision, actually 17 revelations or showings, she called them, of Jesus. And Jesus first, it went through in detail what the crucifixion was like, but with what she said, a friendly and merry countenance. So with love and even humor, Jesus revealed to her what he went through. And then about halfway through these visions, Christ revealed himself as herself, Christ the mother. She realized only a mother could break herself open and pour herself out as Christ has done for us. So it had to be a woman. And that from there on, she called them Christ the mother. And what Christ the mother said to Julian over and over throughout the showings was, and I'm sure you know this saying, so say it with me: all will be well, and all will be well, and every kind of thing shall be well. All will be well, and all will be well, and every kind of thing shall be well. So this was the primary message from Christ the mother. So when Julian emerged from her illness, when she woke up, the priest actually came to administer last rites, because her mother is the only person we know that was with her. Her mother was at her bedside, and she called for the priest to come and give Julian last rites. And the priest came and held the crucifix over her face and said, as you take your last breaths, look into the eyes of Christ, and you will go straight to heaven. And that's where the visions came from. As she was looking into that crucifix, everything got dark all around, and she thought she was dying, but then Christ was illuminated and came to life, and the visions flowed from there. So when she emerged from her illness and she sat up and the illness just fell from her, she immediately wrote it all down. And then she enclosed herself in an anchor hold for the rest of her life. It was probably a couple of years after the visions. And she attached her anchor hold to the Church of St. Julian in Norwich, England. And that's the name that she's known by is Lady Julian. We don't know what her original name was. Sometimes Lady Juliana. And so when she enclosed herself in this anchor hold, she spent the rest of her life writing what's known as the long text. So the short text was the verbatim visions, and the long text is the visions with her reflections over the years as the years unfolded, enclosed in the anchor hold as an anchoress, solitary. The wisdom she gleaned from each one of these visions. It was such a joy to translate Julian's showings. And so I think about with Julian what the desert mothers and fathers said. I'm not sure which one, maybe one of you all knows which one of the desert fathers or mothers said this. They were known, they were the early monks in the beginning of the monastic movement in Palestine and Egypt in the early centuries after Christ, who removed themselves from society and went into the desert to live not exactly as hermits, but in isolated, secluded huts. But then they also had communal prayers. And an anchoress or an anchorite, the anchorites were not hermits either. They didn't remove themselves completely from society. They lived a life of prayer and contemplation. They lived alone. Julian never left her anchor hold for the rest of her life, as was the custom of the time. Many people were doing this. But they also had congress with the world. So Julian, for instance, the church of St. Julian was in the middle of a bustling city of Norwich. It was a port city. People were coming and going all the time. And she had a window that faced outward onto the street. The other window on the other side of her small anchor hold faced into the church, and she could open it and close it, and she could receive communion and participate in Mass every day. But the window that I'm interested in right now is the window that opened onto the streets. And once a day, apparently, she would have like office hours, like Lucy, Lucy in the Peanuts comic strip. So she'd be present and she would be available for counsel. And the townspeople would come to her window during those hours and ask for advice, and she would give it. I like to imagine that they would gossip a bit too, and that she would chuckle and enjoy it. Maybe they brought her sweet things to eat or nice food. There's some evidence that she had a cat. So some of you have probably heard Julian and the cat story, and probably had a garden where she grew a few herbs and maybe some food, maybe kept bees. I think she might have been a beekeeper, but she would have relationships with people through this window, and she would offer what she could to soothe people, to counsel them, to help them on their spiritual journeys as a spiritual guide, spiritual director, or companion. But the early, back to the desert fathers and mothers, one of the sayings, sorry, I went off on a tangent, but I'm back, was something like, enter your cell and your cell will teach you everything. Go into your cell and your cell will teach you everything. I think it was even go into your cell and stay there, and your cell will teach you everything. It's one of those pithy sayings we've been given from the desert parents, let's call them. And that was Julian. And that's us in grief. I know it seems counterintuitive to turn inward when our hearts are blazing with loss, with grief. But I think there is also a beckoning. If we can listen, if we can lean into it, that says, come into your cell and stay here, and your cell will teach you everything. So trust it, my friends. When we are broken open, the angels come rushing in, but we may miss it if we distract ourselves. I think that's enough from me for now. I'd love to hear, Carolyn, if you have any reflections on the angels come rushing in.
That was beautiful.
Thank
Just
you.
beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Actually, I have a lot of things I wanted to get your response to, because what you brought up some points that I thought were particularly unusual, like the people in grief wanting to go back to that moment of grief, or wanting to be in that intense state of grief and not wanting to be out of it, which is such a paradox. And But I thought about that, and oddly enough, I think it's the same like crisis addicts.
Hmm.
Some people are crisis addicts. They need to be in crisis.
Hmm.
And I think the reason is that it focuses, like grief, your attention comes to one place in a way that you're normally not focused. You're normally fragmented and you can't pull yourself together. Life is full of distractions and pettiness and
Mhm.
and and judgments and this and that, and you can't get yourself together. But what a crisis does is it focuses you,
Hmm.
and you say, I don't have time for this. I mean, do you get what happened? Just leave me alone. All I want to do is focus on this. And all of a sudden, all your fragments come together.
Wow.
All of a sudden, you prioritize in a way that, to put it in Buddhist speak, you detach from all the illusions that all of these things were important, and you realize none of that's important. This is what's important. And you suddenly prioritize in terms of life and love. Love, life, death here. And the you focus completely on the purpose of life and the ending of a life and the purpose of your life. And what happens when we go into loss is, and when we go into the loss of some, every single time we have the conversation, this reminds us again of how precious life is, how precious people are. We go right back into that conversation that, boy, life is short, life is this is precious, these are the things that matter. And then we get distracted again. And
That
it's
is
like,
it. That is a brilliant insight. Yes.
and so what crisis does is that we become a bottle of perfume.
Hmm.
And then as soon as we're out of the immediacy of the crisis, as soon as we're out of it, we start diluting ourselves into the cologne of life and the toilet water even, and we get distracted. But in that intensity, that we are absolutely solely focused on only life and death and purpose and meaning, all of those questions come together in a catastrophe or in a crisis. All of it. And we are confronting, what is the purpose of life? What was the meaning? What was the purpose of their life? Why now? Why this? Why am I still here? Why did I survive this? With all of these questions that you don't normally dwell on, but you are forced to dwell on when a loss happens. Could I have done something different? Is there someone in charge here? What's the meaning of this? Should I change the direction of my life? All of these significant questions that maybe you would not have asked yourself, you are now asking yourself. And it calls for, sometimes it really, because you are so focused, and because in that focus you are prioritizing in a way that you can't bring yourself to do under normal circumstances, you're able to say, that's it, I'm doing this. I'm shifting gears. The death of this person or the loss of this person or the ending of this is finally giving me the presence to unplug from this and do this.
Hmm.
And I think that's why trauma is transformational,
Right.
because you are fully in a present state in a way that, we're usually fragmented. I think this is the same reason people are romance addicts,
Hmm.
because they that's what an addict, they are in the high of the romance, and what it does is it focuses you, it gets you high, and everything else doesn't have authority over you. The just boring, ordinary distractions can't drain you in the way that they do when you don't have another significant other to get high over. And as soon as that romance becomes boring, you get fragmented. And so you have to go and get high again.
That's amazing. I'm just making this connection. So Leonard Cohen was interviewed in Interview Magazine many years ago. And I remember reading it. And he said, people talk about falling in love as being an illusion, that you just project onto the blank screen of the other person all your own desires and projections. And he said it's actually the opposite. He said when you fall in love, you're seeing the person truly. And then when the love becomes kind of an everyday experience and you maybe aren't quite in love anymore, it's because the veils have now dropped again and you're no longer seeing the true person. So it just turns that whole psychobabble on its head. And it's very much what you're talking about. It just hones everything and clarifies everything.
I think what you're seeing is the fantasy projection.
Do you?
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God, yeah. I mean, what I've said to people for so long, and I totally believe this, and I won't change my opinion on this at all, is that when you're dating somebody, think of all your archetypal patterns, right? You have a good dozen archetypal patterns that are your standard contract, your team, right? And when people are dating, they rarely take all 12 out.
Yeah.
Right? They don't. Let's face it. If you're an addict or you're a coward or you're a gambler, you don't take those archetypes out on the first date. You say you stay here.
Yeah.
And you take out your more playful archetype. You might take your pueriturnus out. You might take your femme fatale, maybe your fashionista, whichever archetype you feel the most comfortable in, who's the most refined.
Mm.
And these are the archetypal patterns that you consistently take out. But you don't take out your shadow necessarily, and you're not going to take out your compulsive spender, and you're not going to take out the archetype that maybe you're a thief, maybe you're a kleptomaniac. You're not going to bring that out, right?
Right.
And then what happens is, as soon as a person gets married, which is another archetype,
Mhm.
an archetype, as soon as all of a sudden the values of marriage, which are not romantic fundamentally, but survival.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
as soon as you enter into the survival archetype, everything changes. Like suddenly romance is not lead, but survival. You better never cheat on me.
Right.
You better never cheat it. You better this. And if we have kids, there better be support going on, and there better be this, and there better be that. And survival is what takes over. And all your 12 archetypes move in, and all his 12 archetypes move in. And all of a sudden you start talking like this. My God, is it psychically crowded in here? I need my own space. What is this?
Mm.
And you are feeling the psychic congestion. And then you think, who is this person I married? Who is this person? Then do you know how often that happens?
Mm. Yeah.
And how many times, how many people have said to me, as soon as I got married, I thought, what have I done?
Mm.
What have I done? And it's that entering into that archetype and entering into those other patterns. So to go back to this idea of the pattern of crisis, the habit of crisis, and thinking that like crisis romance, that
Mm.
thinking that you're actually seeing someone fully. No, you're not.
Mm. You don't agree with Leonard?
No, not in the least.
Mm.
I think that what you see is an ideal fantasy, which is why as soon as you get to know them and get to know the other patterns, that and the shadow side, you think, wait a minute here.
Mm.
I'm not sure I like all these other patterns and, da 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 da. And you see the more human element, because it's like people are going to age. You see that they have age lines. You see that, this kind of thing, you know.
Yeah. But to bring it back to this, the power of grief and loss to
Yeah.
kind of strip away the extraneous and bring us right to kind of one pointed what matters state. I think that's definitely true. And there can be great boons to that fleeting moment of reordering our priorities, which I'll talk more about next time, by the way.
But I do think that part of, because I think everything is designed to help us move to the next level. It's everything is designed for that transformational experience
Mhm.
to move us on, to move us through absolutely everything, including the intense focus of when we feel so fragmented in when we feel like in an intense loss. It focuses us, and it focuses us because it we're sup- we're now in a position, often of necessity, to make choices that we've never had to make before,
Mhm.
and that requires a level of presence that wasn't required prior to that,
Hmm.
and a level of endurance and a level of self that um, we didn't know we had to that we didn't know we had to have before.
Right.
And like, I mean, how many people I know said suddenly I was in charge of my family.
Right.
Suddenly I was the one in charge of 3 kids because my husband was dead, and all of a sudden I was the one in charge, and I had to rise to that occasion, and I didn't want to rise to that occasion.
Carolyn, what do you think about the possibility that when people exhibit this almost superhuman strength and moral courage and these other capacities in the wake of a great loss, and people are looking at them going, wow, she's so strong or whatever, maybe that's the angelic support.
Absolutely. I really do think, and I think, and thank you for bringing that up, because I have countless stories of people in the midst of the worst grief. Like you, I have a friend who lost all 3 children,
Mm.
and in the midst of it, to hear a inner voice that says, you'll get through this. You'll get through this. And and the thing is, heaven, I have never once, not in all my years of reading, not in all my years of prayer, not in all my years, have I come across anything, not the writings of any mystics, not from any tradition, in which heaven has explained itself,
Hmm.
in which heaven has said, Poppy, stop, in which heaven has said, this is why this happened to you.
Right.
Never, not once, not once, not in any tradition, not in Buddhism, not in Christianity, not in Judaism, not in my dog biting my hand off because she did something right now. Um, but it has never, never, never happened.
Hmm.
Instead, what guidance has consistently, no matter what tradition, it has always said, you're going to get through this. It never
Hmm.
tells you why. It never says, and this is how, and this is who we're sending, and this is heaven never, never does that. But it's like what Teresa of Avila, our beloved Teresa of Avila, said: when God gets into the walls of your soul for just a second, it's enough for a lifetime.
Hmm.
And I know in my own experience, the experiences I have had where I have heard guidance directly. Um, Honest to God, I'm going to put you on eBay. Um,
I'll take her.
she needs to go outside. That's what this is about.
Yeah.
Um, where I have heard heaven directly. In those instances, the encounter was brief, so profound, and it has stuck with me for a lifetime.
Yeah.
For a lifetime. And it wasn't as though I had a vision, I had nothing, but it was like when sacred contracts dropped in complete as a completely whole. What's wrong with your nose, honey? Oh, honey. My Poppy, shh, Poppy, she can't breathe. When sacred contracts, when anatomy of the spirit dropped in one huge body of work in a microsecond, and I went from, and I was just going to do energy anatomy, the 7 chakras, to, oh my God. And this whole thing just dropped in a second, just like that. And the other experiences I have had that have been that absolutely profound, that incredibly clear, that incredibly direct, and the numerous readings where I was told that this is what's going on with this person. Tell them this, tell them that. I have never doubted that there is profound guidance. We don't need grief to access that guidance.
Right.
Let's be very clear.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up.
Grief. We don't need to be in this state of mourning. We don't need to be in a state of panic. None of that is an essential ingredient of getting guidance. Prayer is the essential ingredient. Prayer and grace is the essential ingredient. But somehow, when we go through loss, when we go through trauma, in how oftentimes, I've heard, like, why is heaven doing this, and blah, 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 blah. I think people, I've lost so many family members. I've lost a brother. I don't think, how do I want to say this, Mirabai? I think one of the great blessings that I have been given, if I could put it this way, is that I have always had an understanding of how life works, in that I've never expected life to be other than the way it is. So when death happens in my family, it wasn't my way to say, how could that happen to my family?
Right.
How could my brother die? I didn't want him to die. And I was sad, devastated that he died, and devastated that I lost my cousin recently. But not one part of me said, this shouldn't have happened, because the organic nature of life is what it is.
Yeah.
And my family's no exception to that.
Right.
And I think part of knowing or not attaching to permanence has also been just natural to me. I don't attach to anything as if it's always going to be here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think I'm really glad you brought up the notion that grief and loss is not it's not required to connect with the sacred. And the truth is, it's going to happen. I mean, whether we like it or not, we're going to lose what we love, as you say, because of the nature of impermanence. That which we love is going to pass, and also what we can't stand is probably going to pass also. Both things are true. And so the fact that grief and loss is going to continue to happen is simply an opportunity to keep coming back to remembering what matters. There are many other ways to experience grace.
I think that is such a perfect jewel of wisdom, to close this session on, which is that what we learn in moments of grief, in experiences of grief, is that we really do have this opportunity to remind ourselves of what really matters in life and to continue from that moment on with what really matters, the priorities of reminding ourselves, life is brief. Time is our most precious commodity. Relationships, everybody could be gone by tomorrow. There's no such thing as a guarantee of the length of anybody's life. People are precious goods. This is the most precious thing you have. Stuff is not precious.
Right.
Stuff is not precious. Humans are. Your relationships and love is. And that's what you remind yourself of again and again. And from tragedy comes a renewal of those great truths and values.
Beautiful. Yes.
So, what's the next class, my dear?
So the next class is talking back to God, what Kubler-Ross called anger, and what Teresa of Avila did with great spirit, talking back to God.
And talking to God. Talking back to God, and there's talking to God, and there's just how come life is this way.
Yes, you get to be pissed off about it. That's part of the grieving process.
It doesn't
It's not
help.
unspiritual. Yeah, it doesn't help.
It doesn't help.
It's not unspiritual to be angry from time
Right.
to time in the midst
Right.
of it. In fact, some of the greatest mystics were enraged at times.
Well, I think there's such a thing as getting it out of your system. And for me, how many times I've come across people in my readings and I realize they're so angry at the way their life is and
Yeah.
at their feeling that they were cheated or they got shortchanged or they don't like the hand they were dealt and blah blah blah. And that anger they take out on everyone. But at the end of the day, they're angry at God.
Yes.
Like, how could you do this? How could you do this to me?
That's
It's a very rich conversation. So I shall look forward to that. And thank you for a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you.
It is my honor. Take care, everyone. Love you,
Good night,
Kat.
everybody.